Sign it." Her father slapped the paper across the flour-dusted counter without looking her in the eye. "You'll marry Harlan Greer by Friday, or I lose everything." Eleanor stared at the name on that document, a man twice her age. A man who collected debts the way other men collected cattle. She had baked bread in this shop since she was 6 years old. She had never once asked for anything. But she would not be sold. If you've ever had to choose between loyalty and your own life, stay with Eleanor. Subscribe, hit that bell. Because this story is for every soul who ever walked away from the wrong life and into the unknown and found something they never expected on the other side. Eleanor Dawson did not run. That was the thing. People never understood. The ones who came later with their whispers and their raised eyebrows and their theories about what kind of woman leaves in the middle of the night. They always used that word. Ran. Like she was frightened, like she had no choice. But Eleanor had made a choice. She had stood in her father's bakery at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, with the summer heat still pressing through the walls and the smell of scorched sugar in the air. And she had looked at the paper her father put in front of her, and she had made the only decision that made any sense. She folded the paper in half, she set it on the counter, and she walked out the back door. The bakery sat on the east end of Millhaven's Main Street, wedged between a dry goods store and a barber shop that smelled of tobacco and bay rum. Eleanor had lived above it her entire life. She knew every sound the building made, the creak of the third stair, the way the back window stuck in summer, the particular groan of the oven door when it needed oiling. She knew the rhythms of that place the way other women knew their children's breathing. She did not look back at it. She carried a canvas bag she had packed in silence while her father was arguing with Harlan Greer's man in the front room. Into it, she put a change of clothes, a small tin of cornmeal she had taken from the shelf. $3.40 in coins she had saved over 14 months from the tips. Customers sometimes left on the counter. A paring knife wrapped in cloth, and her mother's wool shawl faded green, soft as a whisper. The only thing left in the world that still smelled faintly of someone who had loved her without conditions. She did not take anything that belonged to her father. She wanted nothing from him. The first hour was the hardest. Not because she was afraid. She had been afraid for years, afraid of making a mistake in the kitchen, afraid of saying the wrong thing at the table, afraid of the particular silence that came over her father's face before he started talking in that low, controlled voice that was somehow worse than shouting. Fear was not new to Eleanor. What was new was the darkness. She had never walked out of town alone at night. She had never walked anywhere alone after supper. Her father had strict ideas about what was proper, about what a woman's place was, about how things looked to other people. Eleanor had spent her entire life inside the boundaries he drew, so accustomed to them that she had almost stopped seeing them. Now, with the town behind her, and nothing ahead but the road north, and the dark shapes of the mountains against a sky thick with stars, she felt the boundaries fall away. It was not freedom yet. It was too frightening to be freedom. But it was something. She kept walking. By the time the sky started to gray, she had put 7 miles between herself and Millhaven. Her feet hurt. She had drunk half the water in the small tin canteen she'd carried. The road had narrowed to a track, and then the track had faded into nothing much at all, and Eleanor had followed what she believed was north by keeping the mountains to her left and the morning light at her back. She stopped when she reached the creek. She crouched at the bank, cupped water in her palms, drank until the dryness in her throat eased. Then she sat back on her heels and let herself think for the first time since she'd left. She had no plan. She had known that when she walked out the door. She hadn't had time for a plan. Plans required time and information and options, and she had possessed exactly none of those things when her father laid Harlan Greer's paper on the counter. What she'd had was the absolute certainty, bone-deep and unshakable, that she could not sign it. Harlan Greer owned 3 businesses in Millhaven and a cattle operation north of town. He was 51 years old. He had been married twice. The first wife had died. Young people said fever, though they said it in a way that suggested they weren't entirely sure. The second wife had simply disappeared one winter, and Harlan had explained she'd gone to live with her sister in Wyoming, and no one had pressed the matter because no one pressed matters with Harlan Greer. Eleanor had met him exactly 4 times. Each time he had looked at her, the way a man looks at livestock he's considering purchasing. Her father owed him $400. She was the repayment. She heard the horse before she saw it, the sound of hooves on rocky ground coming from upstream moving at a steady walk. Eleanor got to her feet fast and stepped back from the creek bank, putting distance between herself and the open ground. She pressed herself against the trunk of a pine tree and waited. The rider came around the bend in the creek and she saw him clearly in the morning light. How was large. That was the first thing, simply the size of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he sat the horse like he'd been born on one. He wore worn leather and a battered hat pulled down against the sun that was just starting to come over the eastern ridge. He had dark hair and a beard that was neither neat nor wild, just a man's beard grown from not caring overly much about such things. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at something on the far bank, a deer picking its way through the willows, and he had stopped his horse and gone very still, the way men who spend a great deal of time in the outdoors learn to go still. Then the deer moved off, and the man looked forward again, and he saw Eleanor. He did not react the way she expected. Most men, when they came upon a lone woman standing rigid against a tree at dawn, 5 miles from the nearest town, would have questions. Most men would have looked alarmed or curious or calculating she'd braced herself for any of those. He just looked at her. Not threatening, not friendly. Just a steady, direct look, the kind of look that assessed the situation without making assumptions about it. "You hurt," he said. "No." He looked at the bag over her shoulder. He looked at her boots, which were not made for walking rough country, and showed it. He looked at her face, which she was certain showed everything she was trying to hide, the exhaustion, the fear, the furious determination. "You lost?" "No," she said, and then because it seemed important to be accurate, not exactly. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly. More like recognition. "There's a cabin about 2 miles up this creek," he said. "Safe place, if you need to sit somewhere quiet for a while." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." He didn't offer anything else. Didn't push. Didn't explain himself. Just sat on his horse in the early morning light and waited, and Eleanor looked at him and thought, this is the moment. Right here. You can keep walking into nothing, or you can make a decision. She had already made one impossible decision tonight. 2 miles, she said. 2 miles, he confirmed. She stepped away from the pine tree and kept walking north along the creek. He turned his horse and moved at a slow walk beside her, keeping pace without crowding her, and neither of them said another word for a very long time. His name was Wyatt Cole. He told her this when they reached the cabin, not as an introduction exactly, more as information delivered, because it was relevant. He swung down from the horse, looped the reins over a post, and said, "Wyatt Cole, this is my place," and went inside to build up the fire, leaving her to decide whether to follow. She followed. The cabin was one large room with a loft. It was rough but not crude. There was a wood stove that worked, a solid table shelves built into the walls that held supplies in good order. Tools hung on pegs by the door. A rifle stood in the corner. There were books which surprised her, a short row of them on one of the shelf spines worn from use. He put water on to boil without being asked. She sat at the table without being invited. "Eleanor Dawson," she said. He didn't repeat her name. He just nodded once, the way people nod when they've filed a piece of information away. "You from Millhaven? Born and raised. Long walk." "I know." He set a cup in front of her, coffee, strong and black, no ceremony to it, and sat across the table and waited. He was clearly not a man who filled silence with questions. Eleanor had spent her whole life around men who couldn't abide silence, who had to fill every moment with their own voice, their own authority, their own opinions about what she was doing wrong. Wyatt Cole just drank his coffee. It was, she thought, one of the most restful things she had ever experienced. After a while she said, "My father made a deal with a man named Harlan Greer. I was part of the deal." Wyatt set his cup down. "Greer," he said. "Just the name. Flat." "You know him." "I know of him." "Then you understand why I left." He looked at her for a moment, that same direct, unhurried look from the creek. "You need a place to stay," he said. It was not a question. "I need—" She stopped. She had been about to say, "I need to figure out where I'm going," but when she tried to produce the rest of that sentence, nothing came. Because the truth was, she hadn't gotten that far. She had known where she was from and what she was running from, and the absolute certainty that she could not stay. But the where she was going, that part, was still blank. "Yes," she said finally. "I need a place to stay." "You can have the loft," Wyatt said. "It's not comfortable, but it's safe. And nobody comes up this mountain without good reason." "Why are you offering this?" He considered the question. Most men would have produced an answer immediately, something about Christian charity, or being a good neighbor, or how he'd want someone to do the same for his sister. He seemed to actually think about it. "Because you needed it," he said, "and I've got it." She didn't intend to stay more than a few days. That was what she told herself as she climbed into the loft that first morning and lay down on the bedroll. He put up there without comment as the exhaustion of the night crashed over her all at once and pulled her under before she could think another thought. She woke in the early afternoon to the sound of chopping wood. She lay still for a moment, listening, getting her bearings. The quality of the light through the chinking gaps told her it was past noon. She could smell something with onions, something cooking slowly. She climbed down. Wyatt was outside, and there was a pot on the stove. She looked at it, looked at the supplies on the shelves, and made a decision. The way she always made decisions about kitchens, she just started. When he came back inside an hour later, he stopped in the doorway. She had found cornbread meal in the tin near the stove. The pot of beans he'd started was seasoned. Now she'd found salt pork on the shelf and added it with onion and a little dried sage. The cornbread was in the iron skillet. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I know." She met his eyes. "I wanted to. I'm not good at sitting still." He pulled out the chair and sat down, and there was something in the way he did it, not the entitlement of a man who expected to be served, but the quiet surprise of a man who hadn't been looked after in a very long time, that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't quite know what to do with. She served the food. They ate. And that was the beginning. The days took on a shape she hadn't expected. Wyatt left before dawn most mornings to check his trap lines, to look after the 3 horses he kept, to do whatever it was a man who lived alone on a mountain did with his time. He didn't explain his comings and goings. He didn't explain much of anything she was discovering. He simply moved through his life with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked out long ago exactly what needed doing and saw no reason to narrate it. Eleanor, left to herself, did what she had always done. She found the work. She organized his supplies, not because they were disorganized exactly, but because she could see a better order to them that would save steps in the long run. She repaired a crack in the chinking near the stove with a mixture of clay and dried moss she found at the creek bank, filling it the way her mother had taught her to fill the gaps in old walls. She took stock of what he had and what he was missing, and she wrote it on a piece of paper she found in his supply box, because information was always better recorded than kept in your head. When he came back the first evening and found the chinking repaired, he ran his thumb along it and looked at her. "That'll hold," he said. "It should," she agreed. "You had the right clay. Most people don't." He gave her a look that she couldn't entirely read. "You do this for a living, fix other people's walls." "I do whatever needs doing," she said. "I always have." He nodded slowly, like she'd answered something he hadn't quite asked. On the 3rd day, she found the graves. They were behind the cabin, past the woodpile, in a small clearing she hadn't gone to before. 2 markers hand-cut from stone set into the earth beneath a pine tree. The carving was done carefully, with more care than you'd expect, and when she crouched down to read them, she understood. Margaret Cole, beloved wife, 1849 to 1881. James Cole, our boy, 1878, 1881. She sat back on her heels and looked at the dates. A wife and a son gone 3 years apart. No, not apart. The same year. The same terrible year. She heard Wyatt behind her. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, a water bucket in one hand, and his face had gone very still. In a particular way, she was starting to recognize, not closed off, not angry, just contained. Like a man who had learned to carry a weight so long that he didn't know how to put it down. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have. It's fine." He set down the bucket. "That's where they are. Your wife and son." "Fever," he said. "Came through fast. 3 days for Margaret, 2 more for James." A pause. "I wasn't here for the beginning of it. I was in town getting supplies. By the time I got back..." He stopped. Eleanor didn't say anything. She didn't fill the space with reassurances or sympathy sounds. She just looked at him and let the moment be what it was. "People thought I did something to them," Wyatt said, "or didn't do enough." There were whispers about how a man who lived so far from town couldn't have a wife who died of natural causes. People needed a story. I was an easy story. You let them keep telling it. He looked at her, surprised maybe that she'd gotten there so fast. "What was I going to do?" he said. "Argue with a whole town's mind already made up? You could have explained." "To who?" The word came out with something underneath it. Not bitterness, exactly more like an old tiredness. "You explain yourself to people who aren't listening, and all you do is make yourself look desperate. I had nothing to prove. I knew what happened. Margaret knew what I was." He glanced at the stone markers. That was enough. Eleanor stood up. "It shouldn't have been enough," she said. "You shouldn't have had to be enough all by yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose I shouldn't have." That evening after supper, she helped him with something she hadn't expected. He had a box on the high shelf. She'd noticed it but hadn't touched it, and he brought it down and set it on the table and opened it. Inside were papers, a deed, letters, a small leather pouch with a button that she recognized as a woman's button, fancy mother of pearl, the kind you'd use on a Sunday dress. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I should write to my brother in Wyoming. Let him know I'm still alive. We haven't spoken in 2 years." "Why 2 years?" He sided with the town, after Margaret and James died. A pause. "Or I thought he did. Looking back, I think he was just grieving too, and I took it wrong." Eleanor looked at the papers in front of him. At the hands that rested on the table beside them, large work-roughened hands completely still. "What would you say?" she asked. "That's the part I can't work out." She pulled the paper toward her, found the pencil in the supply box without being asked, and looked up at him. "Say it out loud," she said. "Just say it, like you're talking to him. I'll write down what's worth keeping." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm not good at..." "I know. Say it anyway." What came out of him over the next hour was not elegant. It was halting and sometimes circular, and twice he said, "Never mind, scratch that," and she scratched it. But underneath the hesitation, there was something real. The voice of a man who had missed his brother, who was too proud to have said so, who was tired of being alone with his grief and his reputation, and the silent markers behind the woodpile. She wrote it down. She shaped it. She showed it to him when they were done. He read it twice. "That's better than I could have said it," he told her. "It is what you said," Eleanor answered. "I just took out the parts where you talked yourself out of it." He looked at the letter again. Something in his expression moved, a slight softening around the jaw, a loosening in the set of his shoulders. "I don't know why you do this for me," he said. "You gave me a place to sleep," she said simply. "This didn't cost me anything." He folded the letter carefully. "It cost you time," he said. "I have time," Eleanor answered. "For the first time in my life, I have all the time in the world." On the 5th day, Wyatt rode down to town. He told her he'd be back by dark. He told her where the rifle was and how to use it in short, practical sentences that assumed she was intelligent enough to follow instructions, which was more consideration than most people had ever given her. He told her not to answer the door if anyone came, not because he expected anyone, but because it was better to be certain. She spent the day in a way she hadn't spent a day in as long as she could remember. She did what she wanted. She read one of his books, a dog-eared history of the fur trade, not what she would have chosen herself, but absorbing in its own way. She wrote in the journal she'd begun keeping in the margin of some old paper. She found notes, observations, the thoughts that had been crowding her head since she left Millhaven, and finally had room to surface. She made bread a proper loaf slow risen, because she had the time, and because the act of making bread was one of the things in the world she genuinely loved: the smell, and the rhythm, and the particular satisfaction of watching something formless become something real and nourishing. She was pulling the bread from the oven when she heard the horse. She went to the window. Wyatt was coming up the track as expected. But behind him, a little ways back, there was a second rider. She didn't recognize the man. But she recognized the way he rode, loose and confident, like someone who knew he had the right to go anywhere he chose, who had never in his life worried about whether he was welcome. She was back from the window before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She heard Wyatt's horse stop. Heard voices. "Just looking for information, Cole. Town's talking. Woman answers your description, was seen on the North Road at dawn 6 days ago." "I haven't seen any women on my mountain." Wyatt's voice flat and even. "Word is her father's looking for her. Harlan Greer's looking for her." A pause waited. "You know what kind of looking Harlan Greer does." "I do." A beat. "And I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell Greer if he came up here himself. I haven't seen any women on my mountain. I live alone. I intend to keep living alone. If that changes, you'll be the last person I inform." A silence. "You know you can't keep trouble off your doorstep forever, Cole." "I'm not trying to keep it off," Wyatt said. "I'm inviting it to try the front door." The second rider seemed to consider this for a moment. Then the sound of a horse turning hooves, moving away, heading back down the track. Eleanor let out the breath she'd been holding. The cabin door opened. Wyatt came in. He looked at her standing in the middle of the room with flowers still on her hands and the bread on the table between them, and something passed between them that wasn't words. An acknowledgement. A shared understanding of what had just happened and what it meant. "You heard that," he said. "Yes. They'll come back." "I know." He took off his hat and set it on the peg by the door, and he looked at her with the careful directness she had come to expect from him. "You have choices," he said. "I want you to understand that. You can go north to Helena. I know someone there who runs a boarding house, decent woman. She'd give you work until you get your feet under you. You can go east, try for the railroad towns. You can stay here. Those are very different choices," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "They are." She looked at the bread she'd made. She looked at the room she'd come to know in 5 days, the shelves, the books, the careful order of a man's solitary life, and somewhere in it now, the small signs of her own presence, the repaired chinking, the reorganized supply shelf, the letter to his brother drying on the windowsill. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to make the choice that's right for you," he said, "not the one that's easiest." "Those might be the same thing." "They might." She looked at him. "If I stay," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I'm not staying because I need someone to protect me. I can protect myself." She said it firmly as fact, not challenge. "I know that," Wyatt said, and there was nothing in his tone that suggested otherwise. "I saw that the first morning at the creek." She studied his face, that quiet, weathered face that had learned not to show too much, but couldn't entirely hide the things that mattered. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." He nodded. She turned back to the stove, and neither of them said another word about it. But that night, lying in the loft, while the mountains settled around the cabin, and the wind came down off the high places and moved through the pines, Eleanor Dawson stared at the ceiling and understood something for the first time. She had left her father's house because she could not be sold. She had not left because she was weak. She had left because she was underneath everything exactly who she would need to be for what was coming. Because Harlan Greer was not a man who let things go, and the man sleeping below her in the room that was starting to feel less like a stranger's house and more like something else, that man was carrying a reputation, a grief and a silence that people in the valley had decided was guilt. And Eleanor had spent enough of her life around people who decided things without knowing the truth. She wasn't going to let them do it to Wyatt Cole. She pressed her eyes shut. She let the mountain wind work through the pine boughs, and she made herself a second promise that night, quieter than the first one, but no less iron. Whatever was coming down that mountain track, it was going to find two people waiting, not one. She held that thought like a coal in the dark, small and hot, and let it carry her into sleep. Morning came hard and fast. The way mountain mornings do, no gentle easing into light, but a sudden cold brightness that came through the gaps in the chinking and landed on Eleanor's face like a hand shaking her shoulder. She was downstairs before she'd fully thought about it, moving by instinct toward the stove, the coffee, the particular rhythm of a morning kitchen that her body knew better than anything. Wyatt was already up. He was sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pencil in his hand, and when she came down the loft ladder, he looked up but didn't say anything, which she was coming to understand was his version of good morning. She put the coffee on and looked at what he was doing. Not intrusively, just the way you look at someone's work when you're sharing a small space. He was drawing a map. "What's that?" she asked. "The property lines." He set the pencil down. "There's a man named Caldwell. He's been moving my fence posts south a little at a time over the past 3 months, trying to push my grazing boundary down toward the creek." "How much land has he taken?" "About 40 yards. Doesn't sound like much." He looked at the map. "But 40 yards gets me off the water access." Eleanor poured the coffee and sat across from him without asking. She looked at the map, the property lines he'd drawn, the creek marked in a wavering line, the dotted indication of where his fence had been moved. "Have you said anything to him?" "Twice." His jaw set. "First time he said he didn't know what I was talking about. Second time he said, if I thought I had a grievance, I should take it to town. And in town I'm Wyatt Cole." He said it without bitterness. Just fact. "Which means any dispute goes the way the other man wants it to go." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the map. She thought about what she knew, which was not rangeland law, but which was something perhaps more useful. She understood exactly how people like Caldwell operated, because she had watched her father use versions of the same strategy in the bakery for years. Small encroachments, gradual pressure. The assumption that if you moved slowly enough, the other person wouldn't notice until it was too late to fight back. "Do you have your original deed?" she asked. "Yes." "Do you have anything that documents where the posts were when you first put them in?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a survey map," he said slowly, "from when I filed the land claim, 14 years ago." "Then you have evidence." She met his eyes. "The question is, who you take it to." "I told you in town." "Not the town sheriff," she said. "The territorial land office." She'd heard her father talk about it years ago, in one of the rare moments when he'd spoken about business as if she were a person worth informing. "Land disputes that involve water access go above the county level. They have a surveyor. They're required to investigate." Wyatt looked at her. "You know this. My father borrowed against his property twice. I learned how land claims work because nobody else in that building was going to." A pause. "You have a legitimate claim, Wyatt. The fact that people in town don't like you doesn't change what's written on the deed." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the map. Something was working in him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight tension around his eyes. A man who had been absorbing wrong things for so long that the idea of pushing back felt almost foreign. "I haven't," he started. "I know," she said. "But you have to." He picked up the pencil again, set it down. "You'd help me with the letter?" he asked finally. "I already know what to say," Eleanor answered. They spent the better part of that morning on the letter to the Territorial Land Office. It was different from the letter to his brother, less personal, more precise, and Eleanor fell into the work with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She asked him questions in short bursts, wrote down the answers, organized the information into the shape that official correspondence required. The survey map came down from the high shelf. She spread it on the table and traced the relevant boundaries with her finger, making notes. Wyatt watched her, not in the way men sometimes watched her, not with the calculating assessment of her father, not with the proprietary interest she'd seen in Harlan Greer's eyes. He watched her the way you watch someone do something well, with a straightforward attention that carried respect in it. "You're good at this," he said at one point. "I'm good at a lot of things nobody asked me to do." She didn't look up from the paper. "Hold that edge flat. I need to see the marker number." He held the edge of the survey map flat. She wrote down the marker number. When the letter was done, she read it aloud to him, not performing it, just checking it, the way a good baker checks a recipe before it goes into the oven. Every element where it should be, nothing left out. "That'll do it," Wyatt said quietly. "It'll start it," she corrected. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. Just almost. The second week was when the town started talking in earnest. The rider who'd come up the mountain, his name was Pettis. She learned later, he worked odd jobs for various people in Millhaven and had a talent for carrying information in both directions, had apparently reported back to someone because the whispers that started circulating through town were too specific and too consistent to be coincidence. She heard about it from the least expected source. A woman named Ruth Carpenter, who ran a small laundry and pressing service on the south end of Millhaven's Main Street, came up the mountain on a Wednesday with a basket of mending and a face full of information she was barely containing. Eleanor had seen her ride up from the kitchen. She'd gotten into the habit of noting every approach, knowing exactly where the rifle was and how long it took to reach the window, and had stepped outside before Ruth could knock, partly to assess the situation, and partly because she preferred to meet things face on. Ruth Carpenter was about 50 stout, with the arms of a woman who'd wrung out wet laundry every day of her working life and eyes that were sharp and not particularly unkind. She looked at Eleanor on the cabin step and said without preamble, "I know who you are. Your father's been through town twice this week." Eleanor's stomach dropped, but her face didn't. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." Ruth Carpenter came in. She looked around the cabin with the frank appraisal of a woman who assessed other people's housekeeping instinctively and registered without comment that it was not what she'd expected. She sat at the table. She put her basket on the floor by her feet. "I'm not here with trouble," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "Then why are you here?" "Because your father's not the only one looking." Ruth's hands folded on the table. "Harlan Greer sent a man named Dobbins up through the valley 2 days ago. He was asking questions at every homestead between here and town. He got to the Hendersons, that's 3 miles south of Cole's property line, and he wasn't asking politely." Eleanor sat down. "What does politely mean in this case?" "It means he knocked over Henderson's fence rail on the way out," Ruth said flatly. "Just to show he could." Silence. "What do people in town think?" Eleanor asked. "About me, about being up here." Ruth looked at her steadily. "About half of them think you've disgraced yourself and deserve what's coming. And the other half have daughters." A pause. "And every one of them knows what Harlan Greer is." Eleanor absorbed this. "Why are you telling me?" "Because," Ruth said slowly, "Wyatt Cole pulled my son out of a flooding creek 4 winters ago. My boy would have drowned. Cole came through and pulled him out and didn't tell a soul about it. And when I went up to thank him, he acted like I was confused about who'd done it." Her jaw set. "That man has been carrying bad rumors since the year his wife and son died, and not one person in that town has had the backbone to say out loud that the rumors were wrong." She looked at Eleanor directly. "Including me. And I'm old enough to be ashamed of that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't want anyone to fight his battles for him," she said finally. "No," Ruth agreed. "He's too proud for that." A beat. "That's not what I'm offering." "What are you offering?" Ruth reached into her basket. She produced a small folded paper and set it on the table. "Names," she said. "People in this valley who owe Wyatt Cole something. People who might be willing to say so when the time comes." She looked at Eleanor. "Because the time is coming. You and I both know it." Eleanor looked at the paper. She picked it up. She unfolded it. There were 11 names. She looked up at Ruth. "Does he know you've done this?" "No." Ruth said. And I'd rather he didn't. Not yet. Eleanor refolded the paper. She put it in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Ruth nodded once, picked up her basket, and stood. You're braver than you look, she said at the door. Most people are, Eleanor answered. Wyatt came back from the far north pasture that afternoon to find Eleanor at the table with the survey map spread out again. This time with a second piece of paper beside it, covered in notes in her small, precise handwriting. He stopped in the doorway, the way he did that habit of pausing to read a room before entering it, the reflex of a man who'd spent years knowing that what he came home to might have changed while he was gone. You had a visitor, he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth Carpenter. Something moved across his face. Not quite discomfort, not quite surprise. The expression of a man who knows exactly what a person is going to say and is still slightly wrong-footed by hearing it said. What did she want? To help. Eleanor looked at him. I think you should let her. I don't need. I know what you don't need, she said. And there was an edge in her voice now. Not sharpness exactly, but firmness, the kind she usually kept wrapped in patience, but that was getting harder to maintain. You don't need help. You don't need people talking on your behalf. You don't need anyone making a fuss. I know. You've been not needing things by yourself on this mountain for 4 years. She met his eyes. How's that working for you, Wyatt? He stopped. The bluntness of it seemed to land somewhere real. He was quiet for a long moment. He hung his hat on the peg. He came to the table and stood looking at the map, and she let him look, let the question sit in the air between them. Caldwell moved another post, he said finally. Sometime in the last week. He's down to 30 yards of water access now. Then we need to move faster. She tapped the letter to the land office. This goes tomorrow. Eleanor. Wyatt. Her voice was level, patient. I am not telling you how to run your land or your life. I am telling you that Harlan Greer has a man named Dobbins, working the valley asking questions about me, and your neighbor is cutting your water access a post at a time, and the town already thinks the worst of you. These things are connected. When people like Greer and Caldwell move against someone, they do it on all sides at once. They create problems everywhere, so you don't know which direction to look. She paused. My father used to do it with suppliers. Overload a man with small crises until he makes a mistake. Wyatt looked at her. You think this is coordinated? I think Caldwell moves fence posts, and Greer sends men with no manners at the same time, and I think that's probably not a coincidence. He sat down. He looked at the table, the map, the notes, the letter, and she could see him working through it, fitting pieces together in his methodical way. Greer and Caldwell know each other, he said slowly. Caldwell's cattle operation borrowed money from Greer's bank 3 years ago. Eleanor went very still. Greer has a bank. Calls it a lending operation, same thing. Wyatt looked at her. He's been buying influence in this valley for 10 years, one debt at a time. The same way he'd bought her father. The thought was cold and clarifying. Then Caldwell's not after your land because he wants it, she said. He's after it because Greer told him to be. Which means the target isn't the water access. The target, Eleanor said quietly, is you. That night after supper, Wyatt went to the high shelf. He didn't take down the box with Margaret's button this time. He took down something different, a flat tin she hadn't noticed before wedged behind the supply tins. He brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were papers, more papers than she expected. Legal documents, land registrations, 2 letters from someone at the territorial government, and at the bottom a photograph. She looked at it without touching it. A woman, dark-haired, laughing at something off to the side of the camera, one hand raised as if she'd been in the middle of saying something. A small boy on her knee, maybe 3 years old, looking at the camera with the complete solemnity of small children who don't yet understand why anyone would want to freeze a moment. Margaret and James. Eleanor looked up at Wyatt. He wasn't looking at the photograph. He was looking at the legal documents. I filed an injunction against Caldwell 6 months ago, he said. Through a lawyer in Helena. The lawyer took my money and filed a motion that went nowhere because the county clerk is related to Caldwell's wife. He pulled out a specific document. But the injunction is still technically open. It never got properly dismissed. If the Territorial Land Office responds to our letter and sends a surveyor, the injunction becomes active again, which means Caldwell can't legally move the posts further while it's pending. Which means, Wyatt corrected carefully, that he will try to do something before the land office responds. The space between those two statements was where the danger lived. Eleanor felt it. How long does the land office take? 3 weeks, maybe 4. And Dobbins is already in the valley. Yes. She looked at the papers on the table, at the photograph, at the man across from her who had been holding all of this, the grief, the legal fight, the accumulated weight of being a target without allies, entirely alone. You should have told me this sooner, she said. You had your own problems. Wyatt. She waited until he looked at her. My problem and your problem came from the same place. That means they're the same problem. A pause. I need you to understand that. He looked at her for a long moment. That's not how I'm used to thinking about things, he said. I know, she said. Get used to it. The first real threat arrived 9 days after Ruth Carpenter's visit. Eleanor was alone at the... Wyatt had gone to post the letter to the land office in town, a calculated risk they'd argued over for 2 days before deciding it was worse to delay when she heard hooves on the track. Not one horse. Several. She was at the window before the sound fully registered. 3 riders. She didn't know the 2 on the outside. The one in the middle she recognized immediately, even though she had only seen him a handful of times. Dobbins. He was a wide, slope-shouldered man on a gray horse, and he moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never in his life arrived somewhere he wasn't welcome, because he had never in his life cared whether he was welcome. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin door. Hello, the house, Dobbins called. Eleanor didn't move from the window. She was calculating. Wyatt had said he'd be back by early afternoon. The sun was still high. He might be an hour away, might be 2. The rifle was in the corner by the door where he always kept it. The paring knife from her bag was on the shelf near the stove, which wasn't useful for this situation, but which her brain noted anyway, because her brain was cataloging every possible resource in the room. I know someone's in there, Dobbins called. Smoke coming from the chimney. No reason to be unfriendly about it. She crossed to the door, not because she was going to open it, but because being near it was better than being away from it. What do you want? She called through the wood. A pause. Then a sound that might have been a chuckle. Just looking for a woman who went missing from Millhaven a couple weeks back. Her family's worried. I haven't seen any missing women. Now that's interesting. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. Because her father said she was heading north. And this is about as north as a woman on foot gets before she needs to stop. Eleanor was quiet. Her father, she said, sold her. The word dropped into the air, and she let it fall. Another pause. Now I don't know anything about that, Dobbins said, and the pleasantness had thinned slightly like ice over a river when the temperature starts to turn. What I know is that Mr. Greer has an interest in the matter, and Mr. Greer would like a conversation. Mr. Greer can want many things. Miss Dawson. The pleasantness was fully gone now. This door is going to open one way or another. Eleanor moved. She didn't go for the rifle. She went for the window, the side window, the one that faced the woodpile, and she had it open and was calling out before she'd fully decided what she was doing. Tom Henderson, she shouted loud and clear into the mountain air. I see you back there. Stay where you are and wait. There was no Tom Henderson. The Henderson property was 3 miles south, but there were pines behind the woodpile, and the dense mountain air made sounds move in ways that were hard to track, and more importantly, Dobbins didn't know what she knew about who might be watching this approach. She heard his horse shift. She heard him say something low to the men beside him. She moved back to the front window and looked. Dobbins was scanning the tree line behind the cabin with the narrowed eyes of a man trying to decide if a threat was real or invented. He couldn't be certain. That uncertainty was the whole point. We'll come back, he said to the door, not to the tree line. Back to pleasantness, or the performance of it. When Cole's here, have a proper conversation. She didn't answer. She heard the horses turn. She heard them move away down the track, and she stood very still in the middle of the cabin, heart hammering against her ribs, and let the silence settle before she let herself think about what had just happened. She had bought time. Not much, not enough, but time. Wyatt came back at early afternoon. She told him all of it standing in the middle of the room, no preamble. His face went through something that started as assessment and moved toward a kind of controlled anger that was quieter and colder than raised voices, and she had learned enough about him by now to know that the quiet cold was worse. Dobbins came here. Yes. To the cabin. Yes. And you? He stopped. Looked at her, the window she'd called from the door. She hadn't opened the particular way she was standing, which was straight and composed and completely without apology. Something shifted in his jaw. Not anger toward her. Anger on her behalf, which was different. You're all right. I'm fine. She said it steadily. I bought some time with the Henderson trick. He wasn't sure enough to push it. He will be next time. I know. Wyatt sat down heavily. He put his hands on the table and looked at them, and she could see him doing what he always did. Taking apart the problem, turning it over, looking at it from all angles before he said anything. The letter went, he said. It's in the mail now, 3 to 4 weeks. Then we have 3 to 4 weeks. Eleanor. He looked up. Greer doesn't wait 3 weeks. Dobbins coming here, that's a message. He's telling me he knows you're here, and he's telling me the next step is his. Then we have to make sure the next step is ours, she said. You make it sound simple. I make it sound possible, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her. She had the list in her pocket. Ruth Carpenter's list, 11 names. She'd been carrying it for 9 days. She'd been waiting for the right moment, and she understood suddenly that there was no right moment coming. There was just this moment with Dobbins turned back for now and the clock running. She put the paper on the table. Wyatt looked at it. He picked it up. He read the names, and she watched his face carefully because the names meant something to him. She could see that from the first one. Not surprise exactly. More like a reckoning. Ruth gave you this. Yes. These people. He stopped. His throat moved. Henderson I pulled out of a snowdrift 2 winters ago. He said he never wanted to talk about it. He looked at the next name. Clara Burns. Her husband died owing money to a man in town. I settled the debt. She doesn't know I'm the one who did it. He looked up. Why would she? Because Ruth knows, Eleanor said quietly. And Ruth told her. He set the paper down. I didn't do any of those things for repayment. I know you didn't. She kept her voice gentle but direct. But these people want to repay anyway. And right now, Wyatt, we need them to. Because 1 man and 1 woman on a mountain is not enough. Greer knows that. Caldwell knows that. The only thing that changes the equation is numbers. He was quiet. She let him be quiet. Outside the wind came through the pines, and somewhere further up the mountain, something moved, an animal, a branch, the normal breathing of a wild place. The cabin was solid around them, and the fire was low and steady, and the late afternoon light was turning the whole world, that particular gold of mountain summers. I've been alone a long time, Wyatt said. Not a complaint, just a fact. I know, Eleanor said. I don't know how to... He stopped. Started again. I don't know how to let people in without it costing them something. That's not your choice to make for them, she said. That's theirs. He looked at her. Is that why you stayed? He asked. Because you decided it was your choice. She thought about that honest question for a moment, the kind of honesty he couldn't help even when he might have been better served by a softer version. I stayed, she said carefully, because I looked at this place and this situation, and this man, and I decided I'd rather fight here than run somewhere else and start fighting there. She held his gaze. I don't do anything without deciding to. Something in him settled. She could see it, a physical thing, a slight dropping of the long-held tension in his shoulders. All right, he said quietly. She picked up the list and put it back on the table between them. "Then we start with Henderson," she said. "He's closest, and he's already seen what Dobbins does when he passes through." Wyatt reached out and put his finger on Henderson's name. Then he nodded. One small motion. But Eleanor felt it like the first nail driven into the frame of something that was being built solid and real and not going anywhere. The fight, she knew, was just beginning. But for the first time since she'd walked out of her father's bakery into the dark, she didn't feel like she was walking into it alone. And that single difference she was discovering changed everything about how you stood when the trouble finally arrived. It arrived sooner than 3 weeks. It arrived in 11 days. Tom Henderson came up the mountain on a Thursday morning with mud on his boots and a look on his face that said he hadn't slept well and wasn't expecting to sleep well anytime soon. He was a lean, sun-darkened man in his late 40s, the kind of man who chose his words carefully because he'd learned that careless words cost you. And he stood in the doorway of Wyatt's cabin and looked at both of them with the direct gaze of someone who had made a decision and was going to stand behind it. "Dobbins came back through my property yesterday," he said. "Took down 30 yards of my south fence on his way out. Said it was an accident." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "How many cattle did you lose?" 8 head. Found 6 of them 2 miles east this morning." Henderson's eyes moved to Eleanor, then back to Wyatt. "He asked me again about the woman up on Coles Mountain. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about." A beat. "He said that was unfortunate." Eleanor felt the word land with its full weight. Unfortunate. The particular vocabulary of men like Dobbins, who dressed threats in the clothes of regret. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." Henderson looked at her directly. "Ruth Carpenter said you were worth talking to." She was right. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. 3 other names on Ruth's list said the same thing. They asked me to bring this. He put the paper on the table. Eleanor unfolded it. It was a statement. Handwritten, signed by 4 names she recognized from Ruth's list. Henderson, Clara Burns, a man named Aldous Marsh, and a widow named Frances Sutton. It described in plain and specific language what each of them had observed. Fence posts moved. Cattle displaced a man named Dobbins, asking questions with damage trailing behind him like a shadow. It also contained at the bottom 2 sentences that made Eleanor go very still. "We have known Wyatt Cole for years. We have never known him to be anything other than a man of his word and a good neighbor, and we are willing to say so before any authority that will hear it." She looked up at Wyatt. I was reading over her shoulder. His face had gone through something she couldn't entirely name. Not emotion exactly, or not only that, but the particular expression of a man who has believed for a long time that he is standing on a piece of ground alone, and has just discovered that 4 people were standing on it with him all along. His throat moved. "They didn't need to do this," he said. "No," Henderson agreed. "They didn't." The silence that followed was the kind that means something. Then Wyatt pulled out a chair. "Sit down," he said to Henderson. Eleanor put the coffee on. "We need to talk about what comes next." What came next required more than coffee and more than one conversation. And Eleanor found herself at the center of something she hadn't planned and hadn't trained for, but understood instinctively: the work of organizing people who were willing to act but didn't know how, who had grievances but hadn't shaped them into anything usable. She'd watched her father mismanage this exact situation for years. He'd had suppliers who were unhappy customers, who were loyal workers, who would have stood by him if he'd ever given them a reason to. He'd never asked them for anything except compliance, and when his troubles came, he'd faced them alone and looked for the fastest escape, which had been her. Eleanor had learned from his mistakes. Over 3 days, she drafted a consolidated statement, not just a letter to the land office, but a formal complaint to the territorial governor's office, citing Dobbins's pattern of intimidation across 5 properties. The connection between Harlan Greer's lending operation and the sudden coordinated pressure on landowners in the valley, and the specific documented evidence of Caldwell's fence post manipulation against Wyatt's water access. She worked at the table from early morning until the light failed. Wyatt brought her coffee and didn't ask questions until she was ready to answer them, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever done for her while she was working. On the second evening, he sat across from her while she was reading back what she'd written, and he said quietly, "You would have been wasted in that bakery." She looked up. "I wasn't wasted," she said. "I was learning." "Learning what?" "Everything." She set the papers down. "My father thought he was teaching me to make bread. He was. But I was also watching how he ran the accounts, how he handled suppliers when they pushed back, how he talked to the bank when money was tight. I paid attention to everything because nobody told me I shouldn't." She looked at Wyatt steadily. "The mistake people make about women in kitchens is thinking the kitchen is all they're seeing." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Greer made that mistake," he said. "Greer is still making it," Eleanor said. "Let's not correct him yet." The letter went to the governor's office by way of Helena, carried by Henderson, who had business in the city and could deliver it by hand to a clerk he trusted. The original complaint to the land office was still pending 11 days, and no response, which was not unusual, but which felt increasingly urgent. Eleanor was beginning to understand the geometry of their situation with uncomfortable clarity. They had evidence. They had witnesses. They had a legitimate legal claim on two fronts: the land boundary dispute and the pattern of intimidation. What they didn't have was time, because Harlan Greer was not the kind of man who waited for paperwork to resolve itself. She understood this on a Thursday afternoon when Ruth Carpenter arrived for the second time, and this time, Ruth's face did not carry information. It carried alarm. "Your father is in town," Ruth said before she was fully through the door. "He's been there 2 days. He's staying at Greer's house." Eleanor felt the cold move through her. Not fear. Recognition. Her father staying at Greer's house meant the debt conversation was over. It meant her father had moved from creditor's problem to Greer's ally, which meant he would say whatever Greer needed him to say. It meant the story being told in Millhaven about Eleanor Dawson was no longer missing girl, but something else. Something that would justify whatever Greer decided to do next. "What's he telling people?" she asked. Ruth's expression did something complicated. "He's saying you left in a state of mental distress, that you'd been behaving erratically for months before you disappeared, that he's worried for your safety." A pause. "And that Wyatt Cole has a history of that he took advantage of his wife's vulnerability before she died." The room went completely quiet. Eleanor turned to look at Wyatt, who was standing by the stove, perfectly still, and his face had gone to that particular contained expression. But underneath it, she could see something else this time. Something that wasn't controlled anger or old grief. Something that was a specific and targeted pain, because this accusation wasn't new to him. This was the story the town had been telling for 4 years, and here it was again, freshly dressed and newly useful to the man who had the most to gain from it. "Mental distress," Eleanor said carefully to nobody in particular. Then she said, "My father couldn't have written that on his own. That's Greer's language." "It is," Ruth confirmed. "He had your father say it to Pastor Hensley at the church meeting. And Hensley, you know how he is. He believes what people tell him in earnest. Hensley repeated it from the pulpit Sunday morning." "From the pulpit," Wyatt said. His voice was very flat. "I'm sorry, Wyatt." He didn't answer that. Eleanor was already thinking. If Greer had moved her father to Millhaven and put him in front of the pastor, it meant he was building a public narrative before he took a public action. That was what you did when you were about to do something that needed justification after the fact. You made sure everyone already believed the story, so that when the thing happened, it looked like a reasonable response instead of what it was. "He's going to come for me," Eleanor said. "Officially. Some legal pretext concerned father mental instability. Whatever framework gives him paper cover." "He can't take you by force," Ruth said. "Not without—" "He won't come by force," Eleanor said. "He'll come with a document. Something signed by a doctor or a justice of the peace. Something that says, I'm not of sound mind, and my father has the right to bring me home." She looked at Ruth. "Does Greer have a justice of the peace in his pocket?" Ruth's face answered before her words did. "Judge Alden," she said. "He's borrowed from Greer's operation twice in the past 3 years." Eleanor turned to Wyatt. How long has the land office letter been in transit? 11 days. And the governor's office complaint? 3 days. She did the arithmetic. Neither was going to arrive in time to create any legal protection before Greer moved, which meant the protection had to come from somewhere else. I need to go to town, she said. Both Wyatt and Ruth looked at her. Eleanor, Wyatt started. Not to hide or to run, she said quickly, to get in front of it. If Greer is building a public narrative, the only way to counter it is publicly. I need to be seen. I need to be visibly, obviously competent and sane and speaking for myself before he shows up with whatever document he's having Alden prepare. Going to town puts you in reach of Dobbins, Wyatt said. Staying on this mountain lets them tell whatever story they want about me to people who've never seen me. She held his gaze. I know the risk. I'm choosing it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ruth. Who on that list has a reason to be in town in the next 2 days? He asked. Ruth thought for exactly 3 seconds. Clara Burns takes her mending in on Fridays. Aldous Marsh delivers produce to the hotel on Saturday mornings. Frances Sutton goes to the bank on Fridays, Greer's bank. Actually, she has no choice. It's the only one. Ruth's eyes sharpened. If Eleanor is seen in town in company doing ordinary business with people who can speak to who she is and how she presents herself. That's the counter-narrative, Eleanor said. That's the counter-narrative, Ruth agreed. Wyatt stood up. Then I'm coming with you, he said. It was not a question and not a request. It was the plain statement of a man who had made up his mind. Eleanor looked at him. You know what it means for you to walk into that town right now? Yes. They'll stare. They always stare. They'll say things. They always say things. She searched his face, found nothing there that was doubt. All right, she said. They rode into Mill Haven on a Friday morning. Eleanor on the bay mare. Wyatt had saddled without comment. Wyatt on his own horse, and they came in from the North Road in the full light of mid-morning, so that anyone who had eyes could see them and anyone who had a window could look. The effect was immediate. Eleanor felt the town's attention the way you feel a change in air pressure, not a sound exactly, but a shift. Heads turning. Conversations stopping mid-sentence. The particular quality of a small town's collective intake of breath when something unexpected happens in plain sight. She sat straight in the saddle and kept her eyes forward. Wyatt rode beside her at the same steady pace he'd kept the whole ride down, and if he felt the attention, and he must have, he had felt this town's attention for 4 years, he showed nothing. He was simply himself, large, quiet, entirely at ease in his own skin, which was somehow more powerful than any aggressive display would have been. They stopped at Clara Burns's laundry first. Clara was a small, precise woman in her early 60s, who looked at Eleanor with the frank assessment of someone who formed her own opinions and didn't much care what other people's opinions had to say about it. You look sane to me, Clara said by way of greeting. Eleanor almost laughed. I feel it, she said. Come in, both of you. Clara looked at Wyatt. Haven't seen you in town in nearly a year, Cole. Had reasons to stay away, Wyatt said. You had cowardly reasons, Clara said pleasantly. Come in anyway. They went in. What happened over the next 2 hours was not a plan exactly, but it was purposeful. Eleanor moved through Mill Haven's small business district with Clara Burns beside her, and the simple fact of being seen talking, laughing at something. Clara said, examining a bolt of fabric in the dry goods store, with the entirely normal interest of a woman who needed winter cloth, was its own argument against the story Greer had put in Pastor Hensley's mouth. She saw people looking. She met their eyes. She didn't look away first. At the dry goods counter, the owner's wife, a woman named Mabel Hurst, who had known Eleanor's father for 20 years, looked at her for a long moment across a pile of calico and said, Your father's been asking after you. I know, Eleanor said. How does he seem? Worried, Mabel said. Then after a pause, or performing worried. I'm not always able to tell the difference with Arthur Dawson. Eleanor held the woman's gaze. I left because he sold me to pay a debt, she said clearly and without inflection. To Harlan Greer, I won't go back. I'm of sound mind, and I'm making my own choices, and I would appreciate it if you'd say so to anyone who asks. Mabel Hurst looked at her for a long moment. All right, she said. Just that. Just all right. She folded the calico Eleanor had been looking at and set it on the counter. Take this, she said. For the winter. Don't argue about the price. They were coming out of the dry goods store when Eleanor saw her father. He was standing 50 yards down the street in front of the hotel, and he had clearly seen them at the same moment because he stopped walking and went entirely still in the way that Eleanor recognized from childhood as the precursor to a controlled explosion the moment before her father decided how to handle something that had not gone the way he planned. He was smaller than she remembered. She didn't know why that surprised her. He had always been a small man, slight, precise in his movements with the particular authority of people who make up for physical size with certainty. But she had spent 3 weeks in the company of a man who carried his size without using it as a weapon, and the contrast made Arthur Dawson look for the first time in Eleanor's life like what he actually was, a frightened man who had made a bad bargain and was trying to get out of it at his daughter's expense. She walked toward him. She was aware of Wyatt falling into step behind her, not crowding her, just present, available, a fact. Eleanor. Her father's voice was tight, controlled. Thank God. I've been... Don't, she said. He stopped. I know where you're staying, she said. I know what you've been telling people. I know about Judge Alden. She watched his face carefully as she said each thing and watched the small adjustments he made, the slight widening of the eyes, the tension in the jaw as he recalibrated his approach in real time. I'm not coming back, Father. I am not Harlan Greer's repayment. And if you or Greer or anyone working for either of you comes to that mountain again, the territorial governor's office and the land commissioner will hear about every piece of it. Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. I am thinking with complete clarity for the first time in my life, she said. And what I'm thinking is that you had a daughter who worked for you, baked for you, kept your books and managed your suppliers, and was loyal to you past the point of reason, and you sold her for $400. Her voice was steady. It was remarkably steady. That's what happened. That's the whole story. And I'm done letting you tell a different one. Her father's face went through something that she wasn't entirely prepared for. Something that looked for just a moment like shame. Real shame, not performance. The flicker of a man who knew at some level exactly what he'd done and couldn't stand seeing it named in plain language in the middle of the street where anyone could hear. Then the flicker passed. His eyes moved to Wyatt standing a few feet behind Eleanor's shoulder. You, her father said. You've put ideas in her head. No. Wyatt's voice was very quiet. She came with her own ideas. I just didn't get in their way. Arthur Dawson's jaw tightened. Greer won't let this go, he said to Eleanor. Now something shifting in his tone. Not threat, but something that wanted to be a warning, something that had a grain of genuine concern buried under its self-interest. You don't know what he's like when he's decided on something. I'm beginning to understand, Eleanor said. And he should understand something in return. She held her father's gaze. I'm not the girl from the bakery anymore. She turned and walked away. She didn't look back. Wyatt fell into step beside her, and they walked back up the main street of Millhaven, toward where the horses were tied, and the town watched them go, and Eleanor kept her spine straight, and her chin level, and her eyes forward, and she thought, let them look. Let them see exactly who they're looking at. They were almost to the horses when the second thing happened. Dobbins stepped out from the gap between the barber shop and the dry goods store. He was alone, which was new, and not reassuring, because men like Dobbins who worked alone had already decided something. Miss Dawson. He looked at her, then at Wyatt. Cole. Something in his assessment shifted slightly. Didn't expect to see you in town. Clearly, Wyatt said. Mr. Greer would like a word, in person, today. He wasn't looking at Eleanor anymore. He was looking at Wyatt, and the look was the kind that was meant to be read as dominance direct, held slightly too long, with a particular stillness that men use to signal that they are not afraid and are interested in whether the other person is. Wyatt looked back at him. "Mr. Greer can put his words in writing," Wyatt said. "I'll read them when I get around to it." "That's not—" "I'll also be telling him in writing that his man Dobbins destroyed 30 yards of Henderson's fencing on Tuesday and displaced 8 head of cattle, and that this incident has been documented by 4 witnesses and will be included in the formal complaint currently being reviewed by the governor's office." Wyatt said it without raising his voice, without emphasis. Just information delivered in the same tone you'd use to tell someone the time. "You can pass that along." Something moved across Dobbins's face. Not fear exactly, but its cousin, the recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting a particular kind of conversation and was getting a different one. "The governor's office," he repeated. "Filed 3 days ago," Eleanor said. "By registered delivery, with supporting statements from 5 property owners in this valley." She paused. "But please don't take my word for it. You're welcome to write to Helena." Dobbins looked at her. Then he looked at Wyatt. Then he looked at the street around them, where Eleanor registered this only now a small knot of people had gathered. Not a crowd. Just several individuals who happened to be near enough to hear and who were making no effort to pretend otherwise. She recognized Clara Burns near the laundry doorway. Mabel Hurst at the dry goods window. A man she didn't know by name standing by a post with his arms crossed and his eyes on Dobbins. The math had changed. Dobbins felt it. She could see him feeling it. "Mr. Greer will want a resolution," he said. His voice was level, but the pleasantness was entirely gone now, replaced by something stripped down and direct. "There is a resolution," Eleanor said. "Wyatt Cole's land boundaries are reinstated. The fence posts are returned to their surveyed positions. Greer's people stop moving through this valley like they own it." She looked at him steadily. "Those are the terms. They're not negotiable. You don't have the authority. The governor's office does," she said, "and they're going to agree with me." Dobbins was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Wyatt specifically, "This isn't over." "I know," Wyatt said. "Neither am I." Dobbins stepped back into the gap between the buildings and was gone. They rode out of Millhaven in the early afternoon, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, which was the right amount of silence for what had just happened. Eleanor felt the adrenaline working its way out of her system, that particular shaky clarity that comes after you've done something frightening and discovered you didn't fall apart. "Your hands are shaking," Wyatt said. She looked down. They were. "I know," she said. "They'll stop." He looked at her for a moment. "You were something back there," he said quietly. "I was terrified." "I know. That's what I mean." She looked at the road ahead and thought about her father's face in that moment. The flicker of shame before the wall went back up, and she felt something complicated move through her. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But understanding the cold, clear kind that doesn't forgive, but doesn't need to, that simply sees a thing for what it is. Her father was a man who had been drowning, and he had grabbed onto the nearest thing. The nearest thing had been her. That was the truth of it, and the truth didn't change what he'd done, but it did change how she held it. Then she thought about what came next, because Dobbins had been right about one thing. It wasn't over. Greer hadn't gotten where he was by backing down from confrontations in the middle of main streets. He would regroup. He would find another angle. He had Judge Alden and whatever document Alden was preparing, and he had her father, and he had the story that was already halfway told in Pastor Hensley's congregation. And they had 11 names on a list, a complaint in the mail, and each other. She thought about the survey map on Wyatt's table. She thought about the letter to his brother that had gone to Wyoming 10 days ago. She thought about the bread she'd made on her first full day in the cabin, and the way Wyatt had looked at it. That particular look of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone else in the world who was paying attention. She thought about what he'd said at the cabin that first morning. "Because you needed it. And I've got it." She turned and looked at him riding beside her in the late afternoon light hat, pulled down completely himself. "Wyatt." He looked at her. "Whatever Greer does next," she said, "we don't separate. Whatever he tries making you look dangerous, making me look unstable, coming at the land from one side while he comes at me from another, We don't split up to handle it. We handle it together." He held her gaze. "You think he'll try to separate us?" "I think it's the only play he has left," she said. "If we're together, we're a corroborating story. 2 people, 5 witnesses, a governor's complaint. If we're apart, we're just 2 individuals with grievances and no authority." She paused. "He'll try to give you a reason to send me away. Or give me a reason to go." "What kind of reason?" "Something that looks like protecting me." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "And if I'm tempted?" She looked at him directly. "Then I'll remind you that I didn't come up your mountain to be protected," she said. "I came up it to survive. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long, long moment. Something shifted in his face, that slow tectonic movement that she had come to recognize as the closest he got to being moved. The thing that happened when something reached past the careful containment and touched whatever was underneath it. "All right," he said quietly. They rode the rest of the way up the mountain, in the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of what had been decided and what was still coming, and what was between the 2 of them, slowly and irreversibly, becoming something that neither of them had a clean word for yet. The cabin appeared through the trees. Wyatt's hand went up the brief automatic signal that meant, "Stop, look first." She stopped. She looked. The cabin door was open. It had been closed when they left. Eleanor felt every muscle in her body go tight and ready, and she looked at Wyatt, and he was already down from his horse and moving low and fast toward the tree line beside the track. She was right behind him before she'd thought about it, and they moved together to the edge of the pines and crouched and listened. Silence from the cabin. Not the silence of emptiness. The silence of someone waiting. Wyatt looked at her. She looked at him. He held up 2 fingers. She nodded. She took the rifle from his hands when he held it out smoothly, without fumbling. The way you take something from someone when you've practiced the motion enough times in your head that your hands know what to do before your brain catches up. Wyatt moved left toward the cabin wall. Eleanor raised the rifle and trained it on the open door and held herself completely still. She waited, and she did not breathe, and she did not move. And the open door of the cabin held its silence like a held fist, and then a voice came out of it that made her lower the rifle 1 inch before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. "Wyatt." The voice was male, older, roughened at the edges the way voices get when a man has spent decades outdoors in cold air. "It's Daniel. Put down whatever you're pointing at me and come inside." A long pause. Then Wyatt from his position flat against the cabin wall. "Daniel." Not a question. Not a greeting. Just the name said in a tone Eleanor had never heard from him before. Something stripped of its usual evenness. Something that came from a deeper place than the controlled surface he showed the world. She lowered the rifle fully. Wyatt came around the corner of the cabin and stopped in the doorway, and Eleanor followed 3 steps behind him and looked past his shoulder into the room. The man sitting at the table was perhaps 60, with Wyatt's same dark coloring, gone gray at the temples. Wyatt's same broad build, softened somewhat by years. He had a coffee cup in front of him. He had found the coffee made himself comfortable, which told Eleanor everything about the nature of their history, and he was looking at Wyatt with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Your door was unlocked," Daniel said. "I know," Wyatt said. "I left it unlocked for a reason." "What reason?" "Because I was hoping someone would come through it." Wyatt stepped fully inside. "I sent you a letter." "I got it." Daniel looked at his coffee cup, then back up. "I was already on my way when it arrived." Something shifted in the room. A pressure change, the way air moves when 2 things that have been held apart for a long time finally occupy the same space again. Eleanor stepped inside behind Wyatt and moved to the far side of the room to give them what distance the cabin allowed. Daniel's eyes found her. "You must be the woman," he said. "Eleanor Dawson," she said. "You must be the brother. Daniel Cole." He looked at her for a moment with an assessment that was direct, without being unfriendly. "He mentioned you in the letter." "What did he say?" Daniel almost smiled. "That you were helping him with some paperwork." Eleanor looked at Wyatt. Wyatt's expression was doing something complicated. "Sit down," he said to his brother. "We have things to talk about." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "We do." What came out over the next 2 hours was 4 years of silence unwinding, and it was not always comfortable, and it was not always fair, but it was real in the way that only things which have been too long unsaid can be real when they finally surface. Daniel Cole had come from Wyoming because the letter Eleanor's shaped version of Wyatt's halting words had reached him in a way that 4 years of nothing had not been able to. He had read it 3 times, he said, and on the third reading he had recognized his brother in it fully, for the first time since Margaret and James had died, and he had packed a bag and gotten on a horse and come north. He had not, he admitted quietly, handled the aftermath of the deaths well. "I believed some of what people were saying," he said to the table. "Not all of it, but some. And I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong within a year, and I was too proud to come back and say so." Wyatt was quiet. "You should have come back anyway," he said finally. "Yes." Daniel looked at him directly. "I should have." Another silence, but a different kind. The kind that comes after something has been said that needed saying, that has taken up too much space for too long, and can now begin to settle. Eleanor got up and refilled both their cups and stayed standing at the stove, because some moments needed a witness, but not a participant, and she understood which kind this was. "Tell me about Greer," Daniel said, when the silence had run its course. Wyatt told him. "All of it, the fence posts. Caldwell Dobbins, the governor's complaint the day in town. Arthur Dawson at the hotel. He told it plainly, the way he did everything, without editorial or self-pity." And Daniel listened with the focused attention of a man who was reconstructing a picture from pieces he'd been given out of order. "The land office letter," Daniel said when Wyatt finished. 11 days and no response. 12 now, Eleanor said. "I know a man in Helena," Daniel said slowly. "Works for the land commissioner's office. We did some boundary survey work together 10 years ago. If the complaint has been filed correctly." "It's been filed correctly," Eleanor said. Daniel looked at her. "You drafted it?" "Yes." He studied her for a moment. "Then it's been filed correctly," he said. Not flattery, just a quick, accurate read of what he was looking at, which she appreciated. "I can go to Helena, in person. Push for a surveyor to be dispatched ahead of schedule." "How soon?" Wyatt asked. "If I leave tomorrow, I can be there in 3 days. Another day to reach my contact." Daniel calculated. "Say 5 days before anything official moves." Eleanor was doing the same arithmetic. "Greer won't wait 5 days, she said. "He was already moving before we went to town. After today, he knows we're not going to be quiet about this." "What will he do?" Daniel asked. "He'll use Judge Alden," she said. "Some document that gives him legal cover to come up here. Petition of guardianship, maybe her father as petitioner, Alden as the authority." She paused. "He'll bring it with men behind it. Enough men that the document is almost irrelevant. How many men does Dobbins typically bring?" "I've seen him with 2, she said. "He could bring more." Wyatt stood up. He went to the high shelf and brought down the flat tin. She recognized the one with the documents and the photograph. He opened it and laid papers on the table, the deed, the injunction, the survey map. "If Daniel goes to Helena," he said, "what holds Greer off until the surveyor arrives?" Eleanor looked at the papers on the table. She thought about Ruth Carpenter's list. 11 names, 4 signatures already on the consolidated statement. She thought about Mabel Hurst putting calico on the counter and saying, "Take this." She thought about the man outside the barber shop who had stood with his arms crossed watching Dobbins. "Numbers," she said. "The same thing that changed the equation in town today. Greer can override one man on a mountain. He cannot override a documented community of witnesses." She looked at Wyatt. "We need the others here, not as fighters, as witnesses, as people who can testify to what happens in real time if Greer comes with a document." "You want them on the mountain," Wyatt said slowly. "I want them visible," she said. "Greer is a man who operates in the dark. That's how he's gotten this far, small moves, private pressure things that happen where nobody else can see them. If he has to do whatever he's planning to do in front of Henderson and Clara Burns and Francis Sutton and 6 other people who can name every detail of what they witnessed." She stopped. "Men like Greer don't like daylight," Daniel was watching her. "She's right," he said. Wyatt looked at his brother, then at Eleanor. Then he picked up the survey map. "Daniel leaves for Helena at first light," he said. "Tonight I ride to Henderson's." "And Ruth," Eleanor added. "Ruth knows how to reach the others faster than anyone." Wyatt folded the map. "One more thing," Daniel said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Set it on the table. "From Wyoming. I didn't come alone." Wyatt looked at the envelope. "Who?" "Do you remember a man named Garrett Webb?" Daniel said. "Worked the Bridger Range the year before you came up here. Big man, red beard." "I remember him. He's the Deputy Territorial Marshal for the Southern District now." Daniel tapped the envelope. He wrote a letter of introduction to the Millhaven County Sheriff, laying out in fairly specific terms what federal jurisdiction looks like when a territorial marshal takes an interest in land intimidation cases. A pause. "It doesn't compel the sheriff to act, but it makes ignoring the situation considerably more awkward." The room was very quiet for a moment. Eleanor looked at Daniel Cole, and she thought this is where Wyatt got it. This capacity for doing the right useful thing and presenting it without ceremony, without wanting credit. Just here is a thing that helps take it. "You brought this before you knew what was happening here," she said. Daniel looked at the table. "I read the letter 3 times, he said. "I figured something was happening." Wyatt rode to Henderson's that evening. Eleanor stayed at the cabin with Daniel, which was not a plan she had made in advance, but which seemed under the circumstances like the right configuration. Daniel Cole knew how to handle himself, and having him visible at the cabin meant it wasn't a lone woman on a dark mountain. It was an occupied homestead with a credible presence. She and Daniel talked. She hadn't expected to, but Daniel Cole was one of those people who created space for conversation without demanding it. And after supper, they sat with their coffee, and he asked her plainly without prelude what she was planning to do after this was over. She looked at the question honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I had a plan to survive. I didn't have a plan for what comes after surviving." "Most people don't," he said. "What would you do in my position?" He thought about it. "I'd figure out what I was good at," he said. "And I'd do that. Somewhere I chose." He looked at her. "You're good at several things. I've watched you for 2 hours and I can see at least 4. "What 4? "Thinking fast," he said. "Writing clearly, reading people accurately, and keeping Wyatt from disappearing entirely into that mountain." He said the last one carefully, watching for her reaction. She was quiet. "He would have been all right," she said. "He would have been surviving," Daniel said. "That's not the same as all right." He looked at his cup. "My brother has been carrying 4 years of grief and 4 years of accusation and 4 years of proving to himself he didn't need anyone. And from what I can see, you walked up here 3 weeks ago and kicked that whole structure sideways." A pause. "I'm grateful for that. I want you to know." Eleanor felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. "He did the same for me," she said. "He just didn't know he was doing it." "That's how he always does things," Daniel said quietly. Wyatt came back at midnight with Henderson and a piece of news that changed the shape of everything. Eleanor heard the horses and was at the window before she'd woken up enough to think about it. And when she saw 3 riders instead of 2, she was already reaching for the rifle before she clocked Henderson's silhouette and put it back down. They came inside. Henderson had his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized now as the precursor to difficult information delivered straight. "I stopped at the Burns place on the way back," Wyatt said. He wasn't looking at Eleanor. He was looking at the table. Clara had news. "What news?" Eleanor said. "Judge Alden signed a document this afternoon," Wyatt said. "Not guardianship, something different." He looked up. "Alden signed a restraining order against me, petitioned by Arthur Dawson, co-signed by Greer, on the grounds that I am unlawfully detaining his daughter against her will and preventing her safe return." The room was silent. Eleanor heard the words and felt them reorganize everything. A restraining order against Wyatt. Not against her. Against him. Which meant Greer had abandoned the mental incompetence angle because she'd made that impossible this afternoon in the street and shifted to something more targeted. Wyatt was now on paper the criminal. She was now on paper the victim. And if Dobbins came up this mountain with that document and a sheriff's deputy behind him, the law was suddenly pointed in the wrong direction. He outmaneuvered us, Henderson said quietly. He tried to, Eleanor said. She was already thinking. The restraining order names Wyatt specifically, she said. Not the property, not Daniel, not anyone else on this mountain, just Wyatt. Yes, Wyatt said. Then it can be answered by Wyatt specifically. She looked at him. You need an affidavit. Sworn statement, notarized that I am here by my own choice, and that I have said so publicly and in the presence of multiple witnesses. She looked at Henderson. You witnessed me in town today. You heard me address my father directly. I heard it, Henderson said. That's one witness, she said. Clara Burns is another. Mabel Hurst is a third. She looked at Wyatt. If we can get an affidavit drafted and notarized before Dobbins arrives with that document, the restraining order has a counterfiling. Alden can't enforce something that's directly contradicted by sworn testimony from multiple credible parties. Who do we get to notarize it? Daniel asked. Not Alden, Wyatt said flatly. There's a notary in Helena, Daniel said, but that's 3 days. There's a notary in Millhaven. Silas Pruitt. He runs the land registry office. He's not connected to Greer. I remember my father trying to cultivate him once and getting nowhere because Pruitt was particular about who he did favors for. Pruitt's a fair man, Henderson confirmed. Stubborn. Does things by the book. Then by the book is exactly where we need to be, Eleanor said. I need to write the affidavit tonight. Tomorrow morning, first light, I go to town. Eleanor, Wyatt started. Alone, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. If you come with me tomorrow, it hands Greer exactly what he wants you on the streets of Millhaven, with that restraining order in existence, one deputy willing to pick a confrontation. She held his gaze. I go alone. Pruitt notarizes the affidavit. We file it with the county clerk's office before Dobbins can move. She paused. And then I come back. And if Dobbins is watching the road, then Dobbins sees a woman making a legal filing, she said. Which is not something a woman being held against her will would be doing. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The risk of her going weighed against the risk of him going weighed against the risk of nobody going. She could see him wanting to say no, wanting to be the one who went instead, wanting to put himself between her and whatever Millhaven had waiting. She could also see him knowing she was right. Henderson rides with you as far as the South Road, he said. If anything looks wrong before you reach town, you turn around. Agreed, she said. Daniel. He looked at his brother. I'll be here, Daniel said, simply, without drama. Wyatt looked back at Eleanor. Write the affidavit, he said. She was already reaching for the paper. She wrote it in an hour. It was the clearest thing she had ever written, cleaner than the land office letter, cleaner than the governor's complaint, because this one had no room for equivocation. It said in precise and numbered statements, I am Eleanor Margaret Dawson. I am 24 years of age and of sound mind. I left my father's household on June 14, 1886 of my own volition. I have remained at the property of Wyatt James Cole by my own choice, and at no point have I been prevented from leaving or harmed in any way. The following individuals witnessed me in Millhaven on July 3rd, speaking freely and independently, and can attest to my capacity and consent. Then the witness list. Then her signature. She blew the ink dry and read it once more and handed it to Wyatt. He read it standing up. His eyes moved over it slowly, and she watched him read her name in those careful statements. Eleanor Margaret Dawson of sound mind, by my own choice, and watched something pass through him that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but occupied some necessary territory between them. This is good, he said quietly. It'll hold, she said. If Pruitt signs it and it gets filed, Alden's order is effectively answered. And if Greer decides to move before we can file it. She looked at him. Then we make as much noise as possible, she said, and trust that Daniel's friend in the marshal's office was right about federal jurisdiction being awkward to ignore. Wyatt folded the affidavit carefully. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Really looked at her. The kind of direct attention that he didn't offer often, and that meant something specific when he did. "Eleanor," he said, "when this is over." She waited. He stopped. Started again with the halting precision of a man who had spent 4 years not saying the things that mattered. "When this is over," he said, "I'd like you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go. You'll have options after this, you're too capable not to. But..." He looked at the affidavit in his hands. "I'd like you to stay, because you want to." The cabin was very quiet. Daniel had gone to the loft with the tact of a man who had learned when to disappear, and Henderson had stepped outside for the same reason, and it was just the two of them, and the low fire, and the paper, with her name on it. "Ask me again when it's over," she said. Not a deflection. She held his gaze when she said it. "Ask me when it's over, and we're standing on that mountain without anything chasing either of us, and I'll give you an honest answer." "Fair enough," Wyatt said. Something in him settled, not disappointed, just grounded. She had given him the right answer, which was not yes yet, but was not no either, and he understood the difference. He set the affidavit on the table. "Get some sleep," he said. "You ride at dawn." She didn't sleep. She lay in the loft and looked at the ceiling and went through the sequence of tomorrow. In her mind, road, the town, Pruitt's office, the county clerk, the ride back. She thought about the restraining order with Wyatt's name on it, and she thought about how cleanly Greer had pivoted when the mental incompetence angle failed, and she felt a cold respect for the mechanism of it that had nothing to do with admiration. This was a man who had built a system over 10 years. Debt by debt. Appointment by appointment. Small encroachment by small encroachment. And when one approach failed, he simply reached for the next prepared piece. The question was whether all the pieces had been prepared for. She thought about what Daniel had said. Garrett Webb, Deputy Territorial Marshal. She sat up. She climbed down from the loft. Wyatt was at the table awake. She hadn't expected anything else with the survey map and a lamp. He looked up when she came down unsurprised. "The Marshal's letter," she said. "Daniel's friend. Can I read it?" Wyatt reached across the table without a word and handed her the envelope. She read it by the lamp. It was better than she'd expected. It was written in the specific language of federal authority, citing specific statutes regarding land intimidation and coordinated creditor coercion, and it named Harlan Greer directly, not by accusation, but by reference, the kind of careful language that says we are watching without overstepping what can be proven. She looked up. "This letter should go to the county sheriff," she said. "Not delivered by us, delivered by," she thought, "Henderson, in the morning before I get to town, so that when I walk into Pruitt's office, the sheriff has already had 20 minutes with this letter and is sitting in his office thinking about federal jurisdiction and his own position." Wyatt looked at the letter. "Henderson would do it," he said. "I know." She set the letter down. "Greer has Alden. He has Dobbins. He has my father. He has a story that half the town believes." She looked at Wyatt steadily. "But he doesn't have the territorial marshal's office. And he doesn't have 5 named witnesses. And he doesn't have..." She paused. "He doesn't have the truth, and the truth is on paper now, and paper is harder to argue with than rumor." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "When did you sleep last?" he asked. "I'll sleep when this is filed," she said. He was quiet. Then he reached across the table and carefully, without ceremony, without a great deal of weight, put his hand over hers where it rested on the survey map. Not a claim. Not a gesture that demanded anything in return. Just presence. Contact. The straightforward acknowledgement of one person to another that they were not alone in this room or in this problem. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that for a while in the low lamp and the mountain dark, with the affidavit on one side and the marshal's letter on the other, and the survey map between them, like the document of everything worth fighting for. Outside, the wind came through the pines. Somewhere further up the mountain, an owl called once and went quiet. Dua Vauzan E Part 5, Ban Kumkup, The monster became the man everyone remembered. Tôi sẽ viết đầy đủ theo chuẩn sản xuất của bạn. The morning. Wyatt Cole rode into Millhaven was the quietest morning the town had seen in years. No one expected him, that was the point. Eleanor watched him go from the porch of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, her eyes tracking the shape of him until the tree line swallowed him whole. She had not asked him not to go. She had learned in the months since her father's men had come and failed and left that asking Wyatt Cole not to do something he believed was right was like asking the mountain to move on your behalf. It didn't move. It just waited until you understood why it was standing there. She went inside and started the bread. That was something she had not expected, that she would still love baking. She had run from her father's bakery with the smell of flour in her hair and the belief that she never wanted to touch a mixing bowl again. But baking in her father's kitchen had meant baking under her father's rules, baking for her father's customers, baking as proof that she was useful enough to keep around. Baking in Wyatt's cabin meant something entirely different. It meant warmth in the morning before the fire caught properly. It meant something waiting on the table when he came in cold from checking the fence line. It meant her hands doing something they knew how to do while her mind worked through everything else. She had a lot to work through. Her father had left Millhaven 3 weeks ago. Not quietly. Harold Dawson did not do anything quietly. He had stood in the middle of the main street and told anyone who would listen that his daughter had been taken by a dangerous man, that she was not in her right mind, that the mountain outlaw had corrupted her judgment and stolen her away from the life she was meant to live. Some people had believed him. Most people by then had not, because by then they knew things about Wyatt Cole that Harold Dawson did not want them to know. It had started with Margaret Holt. Margaret Holt was 73 years old, had lived in Millhaven her entire life, and had the kind of memory that stored detail, the way a winter cellar stored food, carefully, completely available, long after the season had passed. She had watched Wyatt Cole ride through town for 11 years. She had watched people cross the street when they saw him coming. She had watched mothers pull their children close, and men find sudden reasons to look at their boots. She had also watched him leave a cord of firewood on the porch of the widow Jessup every November before the cold came without being asked and without waiting to be thanked. She had watched him pull Carl Denning's wagon out of the creek bed on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1882, when Carl had broken his arm and couldn't get the horses loose himself. Wyatt had not said more than 4 words. He had unhitched the horses, dragged the wagon to the bank, checked that Carl could ride, and left. Carl Denning, when questioned, confirmed every word. Margaret had not planned to speak. She was not a woman who inserted herself into other people's arguments as a general rule. But when Harold Dawson stood in the middle of the street calling Wyatt Cole a dangerous outlaw and a thief and a man who preyed on helpless women, something in her chest had pulled itself upright and walked out the door before her brain had fully agreed to follow. "Harold," she had said in the carrying voice of a woman who had spent 40 years as a schoolteacher and knew exactly how to make a room go quiet. "I have known Wyatt Cole for 11 years. I have never once seen him harm a living soul. I have seen him help people who never thanked him and never deserved his help. And I have watched this town repay that kindness by building a monster out of a man who simply preferred his own company to ours. Your daughter is not a captive. She is a grown woman who made a choice. The only person in this conversation who should be ashamed is you." The street had gone very quiet. Harold had sputtered. He had pointed. He had used the word disgraceful twice. Margaret had waited until he finished, and then said, "Are you done?" He had left the next morning. Eleanor heard the story from Ruth Calloway, who ran the dry goods store and had been standing 6 feet away when it happened. Ruth told it with the precise pleasure of someone who had witnessed something they would be dining out on for the next decade. "She just stood there," Ruth said, setting a wrapped parcel of salt and flour on the counter, "and waited, like she had all the time in the world, and Harold Dawson had exactly none of it." "And people listened?" Eleanor asked. "People had already been listening," Ruth said. "Your father hadn't made himself popular the past few weeks. Asking questions, making demands, acting like the town owed him an explanation for where you chose to sleep." Ruth's expression was dry and direct. Small towns don't like being made to feel accountable for things that aren't their business. Eleanor thought about that. They were willing to believe the worst about Wyatt for years. Yes, Ruth said. She didn't flinch from it. They were. Small towns do that too. Someone's different. Someone keeps to himself. Someone doesn't smile at the right people or show up to the right things. It's easier to build a story than to admit you never bothered to find out the truth. She looked at Eleanor steadily. You found out. I didn't have a choice. You always had a choice, Ruth said. You just made the right one. Wyatt came back from Millhaven that evening with a receipt from the hardware merchant, a letter from the land office, and the particular kind of silence that meant he had things to say and was organizing them in the order he wanted to say them. Eleanor waited. She had learned to wait. It had taken time. Her instinct, formed over 24 years of living with a man who used silence as a weapon, had been to fill every quiet with words, with questions, with apologies for things she hadn't done wrong. She had arrived at Wyatt's cabin talking too fast and apologizing too much, and watching every expression on his face like she was reading weather signs. The quiet she had learned here was different. This quiet meant he was thinking. She put the bread on the table and poured coffee and sat across from him and let him think. Henderson at the land office says the property transfer went through, Wyatt said finally. Eleanor looked up. The plot you wanted. The one by the South Creek. He set the letter on the table, turned it so she could read it. It's registered in your name. She had asked for this 3 weeks ago, a formal legal record that established her right to the land she occupied, separate from Wyatt's claim on the mountain property, answerable to no one but herself. She had not asked for it because she was planning to leave. She had asked for it because she was not leaving, and she wanted that permanence to be something that existed on paper as well as in her own chest. Thank you, she said. You paid for it, Wyatt said. You went and got it. He looked at her for a moment, in the way he had, direct, steady, like he was measuring something he already knew the weight of. You're staying, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like a man reading aloud something he had written down to make sure the words meant what he thought they meant. I'm staying, Eleanor said. The quiet after that was a different kind of quiet entirely. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. It arrived in the form of Clement Dawson, Eleanor's father's business partner, and 2 men she didn't recognize, and a document that Clement held in front of him like a shield or a weapon, she couldn't tell which. She was alone at the cabin. Wyatt had gone to the north fence 2 miles out to repair a section that had come down in the last rain. She had not expected company. She had not expected Clement Dawson, whom she had not seen since she was 16, and who had always looked at her the way men who see women as collateral tend to look at them, calculating, patient, certain of their eventual usefulness. How was 49 years old, broad and well-fed, with a beard that he kept trimmed and eyes that he kept careful. He had ridden 11 miles from the nearest town. He had not come alone. Eleanor, he said from the bottom of the porch steps. He said her name the way her father said it, like he was doing her a favor by using it. Your father asked me to speak with you on his behalf. My father, Eleanor said from the doorway, can speak on his own behalf. He thought you might be more receptive to a business arrangement than an emotional conversation. She waited. I is willing to forgive the circumstances of your departure, Clement said. He was reading from the document now, or pretending to. She suspected he had the words memorized. In exchange for your return and your cooperation regarding the matter of the Aldridge debt. Mr. Aldridge has agreed to modify the original terms. You would not be required to marry immediately. There would be a 12-month... No, Eleanor said. Clement looked up. You haven't heard the full... I don't need to hear the full terms, Eleanor said. The answer is no. The answer was no before you rode out here, and the answer will be no when you ride back. Tell my father that I am not available for business arrangements. I am not collateral. I am not a tool for his debts. I am a grown woman who owns land in her own name, and I am done. The 2 men behind Clement shifted. One of them put his hand on the fence post in a way that was designed to look casual and wasn't. Eleanor did not move from the doorway. Miss Dawson, Clement said, and his voice had changed. dropped the reasonable register, and picked up something harder underneath it. "You are not in a position to." She is in exactly the position she described. Wyatt's voice came from the left, and Eleanor did not jump, because she had heard the horse coming for the past 40 seconds, and had simply waited. He came around the corner of the cabin on foot, having left the horse at the back, which meant he had already assessed the situation, and chosen not to arrive on horseback in a way that could be misread as theatrical. He was carrying nothing in his hands. He did not need to be carrying anything. Clement Dawson looked at Wyatt Cole and went very still. "This is a private conversation," Clement said. "This is my property," Wyatt said. "You're on it without an invitation. We have a legal document." "That document has no force in Montana territory," Wyatt said. "I had it reviewed last week by a man who passed the territorial bar in 1879. Eleanor is a legal resident with registered land rights. Harold Dawson's debt is Harold Dawson's problem. If you'd like a copy of the land registration, I can get you one. If you'd prefer to continue this conversation, I'd suggest you choose your next words with care." He said all of this without raising his voice. That was the thing about Wyatt. Eleanor had come to understand. The stillness was not emptiness. The stillness was control. Every word measured every decision made before the situation required it. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. He did not need to be loud. He had never needed to be loud. Clement Dawson looked at the two men behind him. They looked at Wyatt. They made the reasonable calculation. "This isn't finished," Clement said. "It is for today," Wyatt said. "Ride safe." They rode. Eleanor waited until the sound of hooves had faded to nothing. Then she sat down on the porch step and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. Wyatt sat down beside her. "I heard them on the road," he said. "Came back." "I know." She lowered her hands. "I heard you coming." "Were you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. Of Clement Nome. Of what it meant that he came at all a little. "What it means," Wyatt said, "is that your father is still trying. What it doesn't mean is that he can do anything." "You're sure about the legal standing?" "Silas Ware spent 4 hours on it last Tuesday. He's sure, which means I'm sure." He paused. "Your father doesn't have the land, he doesn't have the debt transfer, and he doesn't have the standing to compel your return. He has a bad investment and a wounded pride, and neither of those is your problem." Eleanor looked at the tree line. The evening was coming in low and golden across the mountain, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been arranged deliberately. "He'll tell people I abandoned him," she said. "He'll say I'm ungrateful. He'll say you took advantage of me." "Some people will believe that," Wyatt said. "Doesn't that bother you?" I was quiet for a moment. "Used to," he said. "Spent 11 years bothered by what people thought, what they said, what they decided I was without asking." He looked at her. "Then someone showed up at my door who didn't believe any of it." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still pulled tight. "Margaret Holt told half the town what she knew about you," she said. "I heard." Carl Denning backed her up. "Apparently, he's been wanting to say something for years and just needed someone to start." "Carl talks when he has something to say," Wyatt said. "Usually doesn't have something worth saying. He had something worth saying about you." Wyatt's jaw moved. He looked away at the mountain. "Didn't ask for it." "No," Eleanor said. "You never do. That's the whole point, isn't it? You've been doing things for people in this valley for 11 years, and you never asked for anything back. Not thanks, not acknowledgement, not a better reputation. You just did the work." "It needed doing," Wyatt said. "That's not an answer." He looked at her sidelong, and there was something in his face she had learned to read over the months, not quite a smile, not quite anything. She had a word for, but warm in the specific way of a man who does not warm easily and means it completely when he does. "Some things need doing because they're right," he said, "not because someone's watching." "Well," Eleanor said, "someone was watching. They just took a while to say so." The shift in Millhaven happened, the way most real shifts happen, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small ones that accumulated weight until the thing they were holding up finally changed shape. Margaret Holt had started it. Carl Denning had confirmed it. But the moment that the town understood who Wyatt Cole actually was came on a Monday morning in early September when a fire broke out in the storage building behind the Calvert Mill. It started before dawn, which is when fires do their worst work. By the time the back wall was already gone. The mill workers were trying to save the equipment, which meant they were not thinking clearly, which meant 3 of them had gone into a building that was no longer structurally sound. Wyatt had been in town that morning for supply run. He saw the smoke before he heard the bell. He did not wait for a plan. He did not wait for permission. He went in, and he brought out the first man, and then he went back in, and brought out the second, and when the third man was found, pinned under a collapsed shelf. Wyatt lifted the shelf with his bare hands, and 3 other men who had found their courage again, and they got him out 12 seconds before the second wall came down. Eleanor heard about it from Ruth Calloway, who had seen it from the dry goods store window. "He didn't say anything," Ruth said. "When it was done, he just made sure the 3 men were breathing, and then he went and got his horse and his supplies, and he started back up the road." "He didn't wait," Eleanor said. "He never waited," Ruth said. "That's what I told people afterward. I said he's been doing this the whole time. You just weren't looking." This time people listened. This time they looked. Wyatt did not know how to handle what came next. Eleanor watched it happen and understood with a clarity that surprised her that this was the hardest thing she had witnessed. Harder than her father's anger. Harder than Clement Dawson's visit. Harder than the months of building something from nothing in a mountain cabin. Watching a man who had never been seen suddenly be seen. People came. Not in a flood. Wyatt would have shut the door on a flood, but one at a time in the careful way of people who know they owe something and aren't entirely sure of the form the payment should take. Carl Denning brought lumber. The widow Jessup sent her grandson with a note that simply said, "Thank you for the winters." 2 of the mill workers came themselves. One of them still bandaged and stood on the porch and said the words directly, man to man, and Wyatt absorbed it with the expression of someone receiving news in a language he was still learning. "You don't know what to do with it," Eleanor said that evening. "No," Wyatt said. "That's all right." "Right," she said. "You don't have to know. You just have to let it happen." He looked at the table. "Feels strange." "Strange how?" "Like." He stopped. Tried again. "Spent a long time being what people decided I was. Didn't ask for it. Couldn't stop it. Just lived with it." He looked at her. "This is the same. People deciding what I am. Just different direction." Eleanor understood this immediately and completely. "The difference," she said, "is that this time they're right." Something passed across his face, not the not-quite smile, something deeper and less practiced, something she didn't have a word for either. He looked at his hands. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "You didn't have anywhere to go," he said. "When you came here." "No." "You stayed anyway." "Yes. I need you to know." He stopped. Started again with the patience of a man who has learned that some words require approach from multiple angles before they arrive at the right place. "You stayed because you needed somewhere. I know that. But you made it so I needed somewhere too." He looked up at her. "I don't know how to say that right." "You said it right," Eleanor said. "I'm not good at this." "You're better than you think." How was quiet. "Then, I want you to stay. Not because there's nowhere else. Because here is where you belong. Because—" His voice was steady and deliberate, and she understood that every word was costing him something, and he was paying it willingly. "Because you're the first person who walked through that door and saw something worth staying for." Eleanor sat very still. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes." "I already registered the land in my name," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The quiet that followed was the best kind of quiet she had ever known. They married in October on a clear, cold day when the mountain wore its first frost, and the sky was the particular blue that only exists in high country air. It was not a large ceremony. Wyatt had not wanted large, and Eleanor had not wanted performance, and what they arrived at together was something in between the minister from Millhaven, Ruth Calloway, and her husband Margaret Holt, in her good coat, with her particular expression of satisfied certainty. Carl Denning, standing at the back with his hat in his hands, and a small number of others who had come, not because they were invited exactly, but because word had traveled, and some things you witness because they are worth witnessing. Eleanor wore a dress. Ruth had helped her make blue wool clean and well-fitted, nothing borrowed from anyone else's notion of what a bride should look like. Wyatt wore his good shirt and had combed his hair and stood at the front of the room with the posture of a man who has faced more frightening things than this and found them manageable. He looked at her when she walked in, and his face did the thing she had learned, the thing that was not quite a smile and meant more than a smile, and Eleanor thought, there it is. There is the man that was here the whole time. The minister asked the words. They said the words. Margaret Holt made a sound that was not crying, because Margaret Holt did not cry at weddings, but was adjacent to it. Years later, when people in Millhaven talked about Wyatt Cole, and they did talk about him because small towns remember their stories, reshape them, pass them on, like family silver. They did not tell the story the way they had once told it. They did not say the dangerous man on the mountain, the outlaw, the one to avoid. They said the man who went into the burning building, the man who left firewood before the winter came, the man who pulled Carl Denning's wagon from the creek without being asked and without waiting to be thanked. They said the man who opened his door to a woman with nowhere to go and made sure she had somewhere to stand. They said it with the particular tone of a town that knows it got something wrong for a long time and has decided to hold the correction carefully, to remind itself to not make the same mistake twice. And they said Eleanor's name with it. The woman who saw him first. The woman who looked at the story everyone had agreed on and said, that is not the whole story. The woman who had run from a life where her voice did not count, and arrived at a mountain, and discovered that the most frightening thing in the valley was frightening only to people who had never stopped to look. She had looked. She had stayed. And in staying, she had given both of them something that no deed at the land office and no legal registration could fully capture, the particular freedom of being seen by someone who chose to see you and choosing to see them back. The mountain did not change. The cabin did not change. But the names people said when they talked about it did. And the man those names belonged to, quiet, steady, unhurried, standing on the porch in the early morning with coffee going cold in his hand, and his wife's voice coming through the window, talking to herself the way she did when she was thinking through something that mattered to her, that man had changed. Not into someone else, into more of who he had always been. And Eleanor Dawson, who had run away from her father's bakery with nothing but a small bag and a few coins and the refusal to be sold, had discovered what she had actually been running toward all along. A home where her voice was the first thing heard in the morning and the last thing worth listening to at night. That was enough.